Okay, welcome everybody to the SIMNI meeting on the 8th of March. It's International Women's Day and it's also Trisha Johnson's birthday. So happy birthday, Trisha, in China.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for being here. It's a wonderful representation of women from other parts of the world that are with us tonight. So welcome, welcome, welcome. This is actually part of the continuation of our Seroptimist International Centenary celebrations, and it's also a follow-up from our region conference that we had in November. One of the commitments that we made was to facilitate a number of online meetings that followed on from these presentations. Adele was one of our keynote speakers, along with Dame Quentin Bryce, Katie Kiss, and now that I'm trying to remember, I've forgotten who the fourth person. No, there was only 3. Yeah. Anyway, don't mind me. Let's get started. Adele is a SIMNI member and she's been a Seroptimist for over 40 years. Adele actually attended, along with Audrey, the charter when I first became a member. So she's been one of my heroes for a very long time. And it's wonderful that she's actually in our SIMNI Club. She's nationally recognised as an expert in multicultural education. She was the founding principal of Milpera, Brisbane State High School for refugees and migrant students, from when it opened in 1984 until she retired from the role in 2012. Adele was instrumental in establishing a study program that equipped the next generation of specialist English language speaking teachers who continue her legacy. She was also chair of the Friends of Heal Foundation, board member of the Global Learning Centre, advisory board member of Asylum Circle, member of the Global Citizenship Education Network, and a board member of St James College. She has extensive experience and knowledge in supporting refugees and asylum seekers who have been traumatised by the impacts of war and forced migration. So tonight's theme, when we look at women, peace and security, it is picking up on we need to be that global voice for women to speak out on behalf of those that are struggling at the moment in other countries, but also the many refugees and asylum seekers that live here in Australia. Adele, welcome. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for having me this evening. And I want to acknowledge the traditional owners on all the different lands on which you are in Australia. It's very important that we do that and give respect and honour to all Aboriginal elders, past, present and emerging leaders, but also the women who played such a significant role. And over the years at Milpera, I had a lot of support and friendship and total cooperation and participation, especially on International Women's Day, over more than 30 years. So Auntie Edna Billy, who taught the girls to weave, Jackie Huggins, who might speak, Yvette Holt, very, very many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, because I think until we fully come to terms with the reconciliation and walking with our First Nations people, we will never be a truly cohesive society. So when we have people from everywhere else and we're trying to build cohesion in our society, we need to start with our First Nations people. Because today's International Women's Day, I just want to also pay respects to some of the very early Seroptimists, because I visited Milpera. The school is flooded. It's in another campus today, but it was 31 times we have celebrated International Women's Day. So if you go back 31 years, I was a regional president of Seroptimist, and there was a group of women that was called Project 50. So there was someone from Zonta, someone from BPW, someone from Quota, you know, that sort of group. And it was the UNIFEM group bringing people from overseas, and we had the very first big breakfast in the Hilton Hotel all those years ago. Probably that might have been 32 years ago. And then I had the idea that we would do this every year at Milpera, and we've done it ever since. And in 31 years, because I even went today to their relocated place, I have missed only one of these events when I happen to be overseas. So it's that role that Seroptimists have played in my life and in the life of my school. I was appointed principal at Milpera in 1984, and that's the year that Audrey asked me to become a member. And just for hope and inspiration, I just asked them at Milpera to dig out a few copies of the programs over the years. So they generally have a lovely, attractive cover like so. I don't know if you can see them, but there's all coloured photos. And the one from 2010 is quite plain. We obviously mightn't have had a colour printer then, I don't know. And when I open them up, I see the names of women speakers who are in Australia because of the geopolitical events in the world, as in war, you know, other things that produce refugees. But in every one of those pamphlets, programs, there is a segment that says Bursary Award, International Women's Day, Seroptimist International, Brisbane South. So that's been going on for many, many years. And I was very thrilled to see and reflective today to remember the late Joy Summers, who is a member of Brisbane South, who presented this particular bursary in the year 2010, which was our 18th Women's Day. When I look through those lists, I see the impact of war on refugee women and on asylum seekers. And so you can't even think about this at the moment without thinking about the situation in Ukraine. But there have been many, many wars that have brought women to our shores. And in my view, and in the view of John Pern, our soldier surgeon from Rwanda, there is no such thing as a good war and no such thing as a bad peace. And I think that whole notion of peace and conflict resolution and studies in that area, very important part of education. So when I look through these lists, I see a past student, say from Vietnam, coming to address us all on International Women's Day. And her name in this case might be Nguyen Tan Thuy. And she is now a pharmacist, but she came in the very early days. She's now a married woman with children of her own. And the Vietnam War was a very contentious war in the history of Australia. And women and children, civilians, suffered severely. And that seems to be the pattern. So there are soldiers and war makers and so on, but women often bear the brunt. And when refugees are created by the act of war, more than half, closer to 2/3, are women and children. So in the Vietnam War, it was war of guerrilla warfare and particular kinds of warfare. And then the exodus from Vietnam at the time was by boat, mostly from Vung Tau, in fishing vessels and so on. And the policies in Australia at that time were very different. Ian McPhee was the Liberal Minister for Immigration, a most remarkable, compassionate and humanitarian man. John Menadue was the bureaucrat. And when that government went and a Labor government came in, they still stuck to the bipartisan immigration policy. And we still have a bipartisan policy today, but that policy is far less compassionate and, in my view and the view of many people, unnecessarily cruel and harsh. So also on the program of that year, I'm just looking at this for my inspiration, there's a young woman called Hibak Mohammed, and she was from Somalia, and she fled from Mogadishu and now lives in Maruka, married with children. She was a teacher aide at the school at the time. And another guest speaker was the coordinator of the Indigenous Youth Leadership Strategy, Christalee Lutet. And so it's just a very tangible tribute to what I've learnt over the years by listening to the voices and stories of other people. And my premise on that is too, it's a very common saying these days for the young women and girls at Milpera, you can't be what you can't see. And so it's so important to include these kinds of speakers in the programs. So that 31-year connection of mine to International Women's Day. And then since then, there's been a lot of ongoing. And these days, I'm never sure where I stand on this, but you get all things in your feed from shops that sell women's apparel who are now talking about Women's Day from Witchery or Women's Day from somewhere else. It's a bit of a bandwagon thing now, almost like a commercialisation. And yet we know that war impacts very strongly, and that's all in our latest Sir Optimist International statement. Because what war does, it interrupts schooling, it prevents schooling, and if there is schooling, it can be of low quality. So, for example, when you look at the war in Ukraine at the moment, and a lot of women and children cannot even get safe passage to another country, it's triggering a lot of people from the Balkan War because the demographic looks the same. And so it's a flow of refugees, and there's no mistake about it. They're people who look more like us in terms of their blonde-haired and blue-eyed and so on. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if we did increase our refugee intake to do something like the Safe Haven program, which we did at the time of the Balkan War. And in the Safe Haven program, they brought plane loads of Bosnian Serbs, Croatians and Albanians to Australia for a short time. A lot went to Tasmania, for example. I think it was pretty cold there and they're quite anxious to get back, even though the winters there are bitter. But, you know, that kind of thing could happen. Now, when the wars and when the troubles are in other countries, for example, Afghanistan, it's a very different story. And a lot of people are under the illusion that we have been very generous to Afghanistan, that we have opened our hearts and we have all these people. We do not, and we have not. The total Afghan evacuee program amounted to no more than about 3,000 people. It is not extra or additional to our refugee special humanitarian intake. It's subsumed into it. So by taking those 3,000 people, then that eliminates people who are in refugee camps still in Africa or Indonesia or Quetta or in other places. In Queensland, I'm not sure the other states have bigger shares of this program. For example, Victoria and New South Wales probably have bigger groups. But the composition again, say Queensland got, I think the figures are somewhere like 450 evacuees from Afghanistan, and not quite half of those are children between the ages of 3 and going up to 18 or 19, and half of those again are in that 12 to 17, 18 age group. So it's a very small proportion, and that was including people who were members of the women's hockey team or the orphans from Mahoba's Promise in Sydney. So it was their very select group, or the children and relatives of Afghan men who are already here, or the families of Afghan interpreters and helpers in the Afghan war, in the war against the Taliban. So it's just always good, I think, to remind ourselves that can we do more? Yes, we can do more. And yes, we could make a lot more noise about why we aren't doing more, when it's very striking in Europe, where the borders are more porous, like to Poland and other countries. There are other European people driving into those borders as we speak, holding up signs saying, come to Denmark, we have room for a mother, you know, for a couple with 2 children. Come to Sweden, come to Holland, come here, come here. So it's like people are positioning themselves in other people's shoes and offering places, whereas we are saying, don't come here. And if you do come here, the mode by which you come, if you come by boat, you will never settle here. So it's a very, very harsh regime, and it's one that we don't have direct input to other than through parliamentarians. But I don't know if many of you watch the Drum or watch, I think her name is Niall, the Sudanese lawyer from Melbourne. Is anyone familiar with her? She was very outspoken last night about those issues. wondering if her children born in Australia with black skin, black curly hair and dark eyes are going to be, even though they're Australian born, will be afforded the same opportunity, the same human rights, the same social justice as people who have quite different physiognomy and features. So I found that very sobering. The other thing that war does, it splits families. So someone was a Bosnian friend. My Bosnian friends are very triggered by this war because there is not their own leader anymore because they're Australians through and through, but in their country of origin, there are a lot of very difficult and oligarchical type leaders in places like Serbia and so on. And so if they then yearn for a royal Serbian kingdom again, does that mean they will then wage war on Bosnia? You know, Europe is very, very on tenterhooks as we speak, people from those parts of the world. And my friend Eddie was telling me today, had I seen on the news a woman who put on her boy, wrote on his hand or attached a message to him saying, if you find my boy or give him shelter or give him a home, please let him know that his mother loved him. And then, you know, a lot of women make the ultimate sacrifice. And that's why we have in our intake of refugees, particularly humanitarian, we often have what we call unaccompanied minors. They're usually boys because they can withstand the journey unaccompanied. And it's the ultimate sacrifice that a mother might make to sell, take off her earrings, take off her rings, take whatever and sell it so that she can buy passage for her son to have this life of freedom. So, you know, these terrible world events are what have produced the students in my school. So yes, at one stage it was from Vietnam, another stage it was from a regime rather than a war in El Salvador and Chile and Guatemala, countries that had a lot of difficult political issues. Then the Balkan War. And, you know, it was another war that reminded me of these women. There was a lovely school teacher talking from the Ukraine the other night. Like one night you were getting ready for work the next day, except war had started. You weren't going to work the next day and you had to tell your children they weren't going to school the next day. And that's exactly what happened in the Balkan states. And then, of course, the whole of the South Sudanese war, it wasn't called South Sudan then, it was just called Sudan because it was civil war. And there's still a lot of war and danger in those countries. So Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, all of those countries have had students at Milpera because they've had to flee their country. And you can hear the love of country and the pride in the voice of the Ukrainians. And it reminds us, people don't choose to leave their country lightly. People love their countries and they wouldn't leave if they didn't have to. So I think that ever-present thing about a geopolitical situation over which we do not have direct control, but we do have some control or some lobbying to do in terms of our humanitarian response. I've had a really very pleasant day today because I got to speak at the Assembly, excuse me a minute, of my daughter's school. She's a new principal in a very small Catholic girls' school in Brisbane called Our Lady's College, in a tiny pocket in Annerley, quite close to the CBD. And the guest speaker alongside with me was a girl called Pamela Philip-Wani. And she is from Sudan, but she isn't technically a refugee because her parents were well educated. Her father was an electrical engineer trained by the Russians to become a pilot, but he in fact was colourblind, so he couldn't fly. And he and his wife, the girl's mother, who was also university educated, which is extremely rare in South Sudan, before the war and even since, girls past the age of 12 are very rarely in school. And so this Pamela was born in a hospital in Tripoli in Libya, and the father died and the mother came here with 3 children, a very brave thing to do. And Pamela addressed the cohort, it's a girls' school, the whole cohort of girls and the staff today, addressing the two topics, the two themes of the current International Women's Day. So one was breaking the bias, and there's this symbol with the hands. Have you seen that today? I hadn't actually seen it televised before, breaking the bias.
We'll do that, Adele, before we finish
Right.
tonight. We'll get a picture of it.
Yes. Anyway, there was breaking the bias, and the other one was making a noise. And she crafted this really beautiful speech, giving examples from her life, how she made a noise, even to the time of her birth in this hospital in Tripoli. And, you know, the baby was born and there was this loud roar. And she remembers being at Stafford State School in Brisbane and being made to go to the ESL classes, the English as a second language classes. She did nothing for my profession, by the way, because I think everybody should go to English as second language classes. But she felt she must have been very gifted and talented, and her parents also spoke some English. So she didn't want to be sitting in this class learning bits about grammar when other kids were having maths and science. So she said to them, I don't want to be in ESL, or I want to be with my classmates. She got herself out of one class into another. Then she talked about bias, even from other women. For example, the female guidance officer. She said to this grade 12 cohort today, you know, girls, the most important day of your life, it's not your formal day, it's your careers education day. That's the day you need to be concentrating. That's the day decisions are going to be made that affect you for the rest of your life. And she always wanted to do medicine, and she'd chosen all her electives herself, and she was go, 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 this is what I'm going to do. And the guidance officer said, oh, no, you'd be better going into social services. And she said, no, I want to go into science. I want to get ready for medicine. And so somehow she, you know, a lot of our universities in Queensland, I'm sure it's true in other states, you can be at school in grade 11 and 12, even earlier, I suppose, if you're a genius. And you can also be doing university course. Are you familiar with that sort of thing? You can be a school person, but also doing uni. So she started doing science and anatomy and so on while she was still at school, of her own volition and of her own bat. And so she got into medical science, medical bioscience. And then when it was time to move into medicine, she loved microbiology so much she didn't want to move. So she has stayed there and made a career of it. She's in a relationship. She has a partner from Sudan, and the partner's the ex-Milpera boy. And he is he does dress design and landscape design, and wants to have his own restaurant and so on. And because they are partnered, and because to get married, they would still, all with the enlightened mother and so on, still wanted the dowry for the bride. And because this young couple didn't want to pay it, they've been ostracised from both families. So this is like an educated family living here, wanting the best for their kids, the high school education and so on. Some things are ingrained so deeply that it's very difficult sometimes for people to let go. But I found that very inspirational, and that she could really hone in on that breaking of the bias and the making of the noise. The other thing, I suppose, that's been of interest this week and a couple of weeks ago, the release of the report by Kate, what's her name? Kate
Jenkins.
Kate Jenkins
Set
report.
the standard. Yeah.
Yes. So there is a group now, and Wendy McCarthy has a lot to do with that group. She's always made a lot of noise. She used to be one of the chairs of the ABC in the early days, and she's very well connected, and she's just written a book, and the title of it is Don't Be Too Polite. So it again is in this theme about making a noise, about speaking out. And so she has been mentoring Grace Tame and Brittany Higgins. And so they've been talking a lot in a lot of forums and so on this week about maybe there'll be a new wave of feminism, that is driven by different, not different values, but different ideas. And as they say, sexual harassment, it's not gossip. It's not just something that's a bit of a chit chat, and it's a very important thing. And I think both major political parties are wanting to, they're very supportive of implementing both sides of the Kate Jenkins report. But how does that get to be embedded in schools and with the right input and so on? And that is of great interest and concern to me, because sometimes when these things need to be delivered to schools, somebody in Canberra or somewhere makes up a program, packages it up, and then sends it out to schools and expects teachers to deliver it without appropriate in-service and without appropriate discussion of scenarios and values and beliefs and, things of that nature. So we live in very interesting times, and at the root of everything is that whole idea of the reconciliation and the walking with our First Nations people. And, when the apology, it's recently been the anniversary of the apology, when that occurred, every school in the land received a framed copy of the apology. And then Quentin Bryce, when she spoke at the conference of clubs, she talked about having a copy of the Journey from the Heart in her handbag or something to that effect, because unless everybody comes on board, things like that are not really going to be realised. And I think Chris has been thinking about that, what Soroptimists could do when we have our own clubs and then regions and then federations and then the world. So it is another very important kind of thing to think about. And I'd be curious to know how some of these topics that I've been speaking about are regarded and discussed in other states, because every state, while there are the same issues at a national level, there might be slightly different approaches in the different states. In relation to the Global Voice, Chris put out a lot of reading for tonight, so I don't want to reiterate that, but I do think it's important that education is important for us. We need to be lifelong learners and life-wide learners, and I think that's another way in which Soroptimists helps us to keep growing, even if you're like me and you're already very old, as I realised today when my daughter said she'd been teaching for 30 years. I thought that couldn't possibly be true. So I do think that it's a good day for me as a retired principal to give thanks to Soroptimism and what it has brought to me in my profession. And Audrey Peacock walked into my office when I was a brand new principal in 1984 and started talking to me about the values and the beliefs and the action, and they aligned very much with mine. And I'm happy to have had that association since then. Now, I don't know what else you'd like to hear from me. I'm happy to answer questions if people have things they want to ask. I always think it's really important, but I think all of you would know the difference between being a migrant and a refugee. It's a very significant thing. And now there's another group in our country of asylum seekers who are none of the above and who have very little chance of any resolution on their status anytime soon. So it's hard to provide services, education, mental health things, when in a way we are creating the mental health issue for them. Very hard to pretend or to give hope where there is no hope. Can't go back, can't stay, can't be permanent, and then children are born into that. And that's the very reason that people from Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Kurdistan, which when I had kids from Kurdistan, well, nothing was in their column because the country didn't exist. And I suppose that's what Ukrainians feel. What if the day came when if Russia was successful in invading, but not just invading, but taking over, would the Ukraine cease to exist? And that's it, when you become stateless and you get the papers from the immigration, you're reading through the list, all the countries of origin or background, and there's a blank. And that person in recent times has been Kurdish, but their country no longer exists. So don't assume that a country can't be wiped out and that the fear of the Ukrainians is not a real fear, because the threat is there. And, you know, when I've worked a lot with mental health services for traumatised refugee kids, but I could see staff at Milpera, Bosnian staff who work in the office, very traumatised today, totally triggered by what's on the TV and the situation in Europe. So again, you can take John Pern used to say this, I quote from him a lot because he did a lot with the Peace and Conflict Resolution Unit at UQ. You can take the child out of the war, but you can't take the war out of the child. And that's why in my retirement, I work a lot with the group called HEAL. It's a foundation. HEAL stands for the Home of Expressive Arts in Learning. So it's using music therapy and art therapy, school-based in school. Kids are not going out to a psychologist, and the art therapist is a fully trained psychotherapist. So, you know, so that is one thing I do. And now I'm on the board of QPAST, which is the Queensland Program of Assistance to Survivors of Torture and Trauma. And it's also being triggered. And for seroptimists, like statewide in Queensland and even nationally, QPAST has a different name in different states. Victorians is where it was founded by Paris Aristotle, and it's called Foundation House. In New South Wales, it's called START. It has a different name in South Australia. So all nationally in our Federation of Seroptimists, there will be a QPAST in the state in which they live. And they really do need support to keep going, because the demand far exceeds the resources they have at the moment. And if seroptimists have a voice and make a noise, it's to try to get health departments and so on to put money into health services that are specifically for traumatised refugees. You see, there's a lot of money and wonderful services. I love the way we now have references to Beyond Blue and Lifeline, and what's the one for kids? It's in every suburb. The one for young
Headspace?
people anyway. What?
Headspace?
Yes, Headspace. So I've investigated Headspace because I would think, I don't want to go to my grave raising money to provide a service that should be provided by the government. But when you go to Headspace, it's an excellent service, but you really need English to access it. A lot of it is done on computers and so on. It's no good for a newly arrived traumatised person. It doesn't have the cultural sensitivities. It doesn't have the holistic approach. So the holistic approach to relieving the stress of mental health issues brought about by being a refugee or asylum seeker involve art therapy and music therapy, body aerial yoga, relaxation, trying to teach people sleep hygiene, meditation, all of these things, so that kids know then when they're being triggered, and adults too. So a lot of them get headaches. With the Vietnamese, you'd see these lines etched into their forehead where they do this with their nail, you know, and others would have the psychosomatic pains in the stomach or not being able to sleep. And the beauty of having school-based programs is that the kids don't need to take the day off. So in fact, it meets all the needs of the broader education goals and outcomes. The kids come to school because there is a safe place. So the program we started at Milpera is now in 5 high schools, but we would dearly like to grow it in Townsville, in Cairns and in Toowoomba, all places where there are significant numbers of refugees, but Toowoomba has enormous numbers of the Ouija people who have suffered so much. So I do think, Soroptimist sisters, that there are plenty of opportunities at home, statewide and nationwide to make a significant contribution in policy and in action and in material things to help us grow good citizens. Because my goal, everybody's goal at the end of the day, is a cohesive, multicultural, multilingual society. And we can't have that if some sectors have too many barriers to be able to make their contribution. So I think I'll stop there and let's see if you have something you'd like to ask me.
Thanks, Adele. We actually have several members from our Soroptimist Club in Toowoomba online with us tonight. So Adrienne or Pat, would you like to share a few things? Because I know you have been doing some work with refugees up in Toowoomba. Can you unmute yourself or? Adrienne, can you hear us?
She may not be there.
She's
Okay.
muted on my screen.
Yeah, she's muted, but I don't think she's there because her camera hasn't been on.
All right. What
Okay.
about Pat Davidson? Pat White Davidson.
She went.
She's left, has she?
Yeah,
Okay.
because
that's-
Mandy's come on. I'm not sure who Mandy is.
Okay.
They had a they had a young
message in the chat box.
Pat did.
Yeah, she just. All right. Well,
Oh, okay.
I had a quick question. Adele, you
Oh,
you
yes,
kind of
yes.
you alluded to the distinction between a refugee and an asylum
Migrant.
seeker.
Oh, yeah, and
Yeah, or a
asylum seeker.
migrant, refugee, asylum seeker. Can you just give us the quick sort of, clarification and definition of those three sort of categories?
Well, for the migrant, refugee and asylum seeker, for the migrant, there's choice. So the migrant entry classifications are always related to family or work or business or international fee paying, whatever, but there's a choice. They have a chance to say goodbye. They can often remain citizens of that country, and should they ever desire permanency, and if they ever get it, they can sometimes have dual citizenship. They can visit, like pre-COVID and so on, I mean in normal times, they can visit family, they can come and go as they please. With a refugee, and usually there's no disruption to school. So if I have a Korean student or a mainland Chinese student or a student from a European, there's a lot of Colombians and Brazilians at the moment. So they've got full schooling. And yes, they need English at a cognitive academic level in order to continue their schooling, but they haven't got big gaps in their concepts. They're not a 17-year-old who's only had 2 years of school. Do you know what I mean? Whereas a refugee young person, it's bits of family. There's no choice. There's they don't bring anything. Anyone who's done community refugee resettlement like I have, we used to get the Vietnamese from the camps from Pulau Bidong in Malaysia, and they would have the little red crescent toiletry bag and one of those red, white and blue bags. And that was it for a family of 5. Whereas if you're a migrant, they're always waiting for the container to come because, it's got their furniture or their paintings, or it's so different. But the main thing is choice and the point of return. But refugees, the families are split, the education's thing. A lot of parents are deceased or missing. A lot of the refugees are unaccompanied minors. So there's splinters of families, and that will happen with Ukraine. Someone will accidentally end up in Denmark and at least that's all in Europe. But for some of the African kids, when the person comes into the refugee camp and United Nations is selecting them, if somebody happens to be out getting wood or water from the well or something that day, and they are out in the forest overnight and come back, well, the family could have been gone. And then years later, so then there's a special category for that called last remaining relative. Now, for asylum seekers, they're not even granted the refugee special humanitarian visa. They're in limbo. So even when they've been here, and you could see with the Dokovic case and the people in the hotel in Melbourne, you could see young men who've spent their entire youth in a hotel, in incarceration, not always in that hotel, but a long time, for no committed crime. You know, it doesn't contravene international law to seek refuge. So, and asylum seekers, it depends on the manner in which they come. So if they come by plane, that means they have either documents or false documents, and they are very unlikely to be given asylum. And they come by plane and can go back by plane, presumably. But for others who've come by boat as a last resort, because there was no queue, there was no diplomatic line, there was no other way, they can just be in limbo forever. Whereas my whole life has been spent with people who were granted permanency and citizenship and who've made enormous contributions to this country and to the cultural life of this country, and so have their children. I barely go to a single medical person anymore, and I've seen a lot in the last couple of years with my thing that happened to me. And Vietnamese here and Chinese here, like just huge contribution in our medical thing alone. So, but basically the migrant has choice, Audrey, and the others do not.
Thank you for that.
Paula, New Zealand has been very proactive with refugee resettlement. I know when I've been to Lower Hutt in particular, there has been a huge intake of refugees and asylum seekers there. Have you been involved in any of that at all?
Only to keep in touch with the people who resettled the people off Tampa, because we didn't want Tampa. New Zealand took them. And New Zealand has this wonderful magazine. Is it called Mindful or Mindset or Mind Food or something like that? And they did in their glossiest magazine.
Mindful.
Yeah. They had in their glossiest magazine, they had a 15-page lift out a couple of years ago following every single person, not every single person, because there are only about 15 in it, from the Tampa. So beautiful young Afghani women at uni and Afghani men doing this and that, beautiful. But New Zealand's overall intake is very, very small. It's a small country and it takes a lot of the Pacificas, so people from Samoa and Fiji and so on. So in relative number terms, per capita, it might be more, but it's not a huge number.
Mm.
But
Paula,
they do very well, and they took that lovely Beirut Bahani, the author. He went to New Zealand on a temporary or visitor's visa for a cultural event, and he has now been made permanent. He wrote the wonderful book, which was published using a mobile phone. Have any of you read that? It's very, very grueling to read, and I've seen him in a link up with Peter Grester, the journalist, our Brisbane boy who was in the jail in Egypt. Do you remember that case? Because there's a group at all the literary festivals, whether it's Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, Byron Bay, whatever, there's a national, not a national, a worldwide group called PEN. Can't remember exactly what it stands for, but it sticks up, it's the voice for journalists and writers who have been imprisoned for their beliefs and so on. And so on the podium always there's a session and there's an empty chair. So one year the empty chair was Peter Grester himself. He was in jail in Egypt. And the next year the empty chair was Beirut Bahani. And the next year he was safely in New Zealand. So, you know, and a lot of people who are writers and artists get imprisoned and vilified in these countries and have to flee, become almost like political, cultural refugees because they've written something, drawn something, said something that is against the despot of the day.
Yeah. Junko, are you still with us from Japan?
Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm from Japan.
Yes.
Thank you for inviting me.
Junko, obviously there's concerns at the moment globally with some of the Indo-China situation and China and Taiwan. Japan is kind of sitting there. I mean, your country after the Second World War and the bombing in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I mean, that must have had a very long impact on the people in Japan as well. I mean, we're very fortunate that we have Soroptimist sisters all around the world. And even during our 100-year history, when there has been war and conflict, members have reached out to each other. How is the Japanese people sort of feeling at the moment in regard to what's happening in the Ukraine and in Europe?
Everybody's so worried about this war, and especially my island is in East China Sea. So it's so under sea, there are many submarines crossing by. So it's North Korea too threatened our island.
And a lot of anxiety.
Yeah. So 2022 International Women's Day.
Yes.
Break a bias.
Break the bias.
So,
yes.
So it's not women or people.
And I think the thing, and Nina, you might like to make some comments as well. I know that you've been working very closely with the Jewish community in Victoria as well as internationally, and I've had the opportunity to participate in a couple of those Zoom meetings as well. And it's the intergenerational trauma, I think, as well. Some of what's happening in parts of the world now is triggering those emotions, as you said, Adele, earlier, you know, of people that have had that lived experience. But then some of the parents of those that have been part of that, it's also triggered some serious anxiety and concerns there. Nina, are you able to share, or would you like to?
Yes, I can. And thank you, Chris and Adele, for your presentation. Just briefly, I'm a member of a Jewish women's organization, Women's International Zionist Organization. And like Soroptimist, we had our centenary, 2 years ago now. But we are similar, we're part of a sisterhood. Our aims are really social justice. And regarding the Ukraine situation, with the terrible situation, Chris, I understand you're sort of thinking about how my parents' generation, who lived through the Second World War, how the people, the Jewish community in Ukraine, the older community, how they're now going through what their parents may have gone through. And the recent bombing by Russia of Babi Yar, which was the site of a huge massacre of the Jewish community during the Second World War, and I suppose ongoing anti-Semitism, has really brought those fears back not only to the Ukrainian Jewish community, but also to the rest of us. And as well, in Israel, Women's International Zionist Organization, we operate youth villages where we have young people coming to do like an internship at some residential schools. And we do have currently Ukrainian and Russian students who were doing their internship in Israel at our youth villages. And they are traumatized, of course. The young Ukrainian students are worried about their parents, as are the Russian students. And they both are away from home, and both are dying to get news of the situation. And really, luckily, our youth villages have a lot of emotional and psychological services. And I know that those services are being, you know, put into place. So so a world conflict, or a conflict that is so far away from our lives here, has really a big impact emotionally, I think, on all of us, and our mindset and the uncertainty we all are feeling now about the future. So, and I know the Jewish community, we had a Zoom on Sunday night about an update. We keep getting updates about what's happening to the Ukrainian Jewish community. And you know, it's good to know that they're being supported, but it's a very traumatic situation for everyone, isn't it? Everywhere in the world.
And I think, you know, now that we've got technology and everyone's got a smartphone or, you know, access to different things, the benefit of that is you can reach out and keep in touch with everybody. And through our Soroptimist network, we've got 5 clubs in the Ukraine, and some of those members are being able to post daily what's happening with them. We've got Soroptimist members on border countries that are welcoming the refugees and doing everything they can. And I think one of the Facebook posts this week was women in Poland were leaving their strollers and prams at the train stations for the women that were coming in. And it's like, isn't that just such a beautiful gesture for women to sort of say, yeah, take this. I'm mindful that we're nearly up to 8:30. Does anyone have a question for Adele or something that they would like to share?
I just had a question. I guess it stems from the email that you sent out prior to the call with your American Soroptimist sisters' recollections of, you know, the weeks that had, you know, led up to the actual invasion. And it was just alluded to there, like so much of the thoughts are with the Ukrainian people, and I can't help but feel empathy for the people of Russia as well, because they didn't start it and they're in the middle of it, and they're having to, like, their entire economy has just collapsed as well. Like, it's just, and there, as is often, like, even when we experienced with COVID, there was automatic reactions of anti-Chinese sentiment, which was just ridiculous and horrific. And there's this real undercurrent of anti-Russian sentiment at the moment, which is very distinct and different to anti-Putin or anti-dictator sentiment. And I think there's this really slippery slope and fine line that we walk when we forget that the people who are on the receiving end on both sides of conflict aren't the ones that started it, and yet they're the ones that are either fighting it or suffering the consequences of it. So I kind of just wanted to put that into this forum because I feel like it's a safe space to be able to do that.
Yeah.
There are other places where if I said anything in support of Russia, I would be seen to be supporting the actions of that dictator, which is not the case. So I'm finding it an interesting and challenging thing for me at the moment, looking at and listening to social commentary that borders on, you know, not being helpful either way.
I think that, you know, we've had 2 clubs in Russia, St. Petersburg and St. Petersburg Nova, and there was a club in Moscow, and some of the Soroptimist members are still in touch with Russian Soroptimist members. And our club in particular had a significant project where there were 3 orphanages over there that their artwork came out to Australia and was actually sold, and the money was used to go back to the orphanages where they paid professional artists to come in and teach the young people how to paint and draw, because they were had to leave the orphanage after a certain age, and that was one way that they might be able to survive and earn an income of their own. But, you know, Russians love their children too. And when you're looking at the selected news feeds or what have you, there's some there that people either aren't aware in Russia of what is actually happening in the Ukraine. And there's been some, you know, really teary stuff where a Russian mother thinks her son's on training and he's a soldier. And then there's these messages going back, and whether it's propaganda or real, it's the sense of I can see it actually happening. And then the son writes back to mum, well, I'm actually in Kiev and they're not welcoming us. That's not what we were told. And you know the filtering, you know, within any level of government when conflicts start, that mothers don't give birth to children to kill someone else's son. And it's always the cost that human face. And there just needs to be more done. You know, there's a lot of concern about the use of cluster munitions and other things like that, that Seroptimists in particular, through Kate Moore on the chat line, have lobbied for decades. You know, countries sign off on it. And Australia has a very fine line when it comes to being one of the alliances, you know, and they've always sort of, oh yeah, but we're not doing that. And it's like, you know, the Prime Minister made a comment on Sunday, I think it was, that lethal weapons have been sent over there, but wouldn't elaborate on it. And it's like, well, you know, what does that actually mean? I don't know. But Fiona, I take your point there. And, you know, one of the sad things in sport is when athletes work so hard to compete at the Olympic Games or the Para Games, and there's conflict in their country, and then suddenly they're not allowed to play. And they have no political influence or interest in a lot of these things. You know, they have a love of being able to travel. You listen to the tennis world, they say the same things about the Russian tennis players. They're all good friends, they're mates. You know, they can't understand why these things happen. And I don't know, men, they're war toys. And I'm still not convinced, you know, that increasing the defense budget is the solution to this, or purchasing, you know, little submarines, you know, that are going to float around the ocean. I mean, everything is so technical these days. You know, they're all tracking each other, but when it comes down to the destruction of homes, infrastructure, you know, and then there's an expectation that the humanitarian effort will come from, you know, community. They'll be the ones rebuilding it. It's not the governments that made the decisions and, you know, go to war. It is a very delicate and sensitive area, but I'm pleased that Seroptimists came out with a joint statement. And as an organisation, when there have been conflicts, even with Afghanistan, the Italian Union was one of the first ones to come out with a statement. And I was able to participate a couple of months ago in a Zoom meeting, which was organised by some of the Afghan people here in Australia. And it was PILNET, I think it's called. It's an international association of lawyers. And one of the comments that came out of that was, even when people evacuate or are transitioning through a country or refugees there is a lot of legal work that needs to be done. And people either don't speak the language, they don't understand the legislation, the requirements, and lawyers were providing pro bono support for them. And other lawyers around the world were helping fund that. So they mobilized themselves in like 48 hours to make this thing happen. And just to be able to sit and listen in that environment, and then be able to send out a message to Seroptimists around the world who I knew are lawyers as well, for them to actually get involved in that was amazing. So we can be an enormous connector. And I think people have seen some of the posts that I've put out there where if they want to make a donation, the European Federation has a disaster relief element, and you can pay by bank transfer or by PayPal, which I did. And within 2 minutes, you get a response back from the Europe headquarters. And I've always added a little note in there, and they're very, very responsive, you know, and they're making sure that that money gets to the hands of the people that are right at the coalface. And that's the difference, I think, when you have Seroptimist members so well connected around the world, that, you know, from my hand to their hand, to the hand that needs it most, is where that is being directed. So are there any more questions for Adele before we bring our little session to a close? Kath, did you have something you want to say?
Adele, just a quick one. You said there's 5 schools now, as well as Milpera, and are there any on the north side?
There was one at Kedron, program at Kedron, and I think that school didn't end up maintaining its intake of refugee young people. And then I think they also were funding their own therapist, but I'm not sure if it's there at all, but there certainly was one at Kedron. It has to be where there are refugees. So it's St. James in the Valley, Milpera, Yeronga High School, Woodridge. And our aim was for the schools to like it and appreciate it and then take over the payment. So that is a bit what happened in the Kedron area. But you see, where refugees settle, it's all about affordable housing. And now there's no affordable housing there. So, you know, the schools that really need it again, and we haven't got the money to do it, are Glenala again and Redbank Plains, you know, because that's where, if there is any housing, and that's nearly all been flooded just recently too.
Yeah.
So poorer people can't buy in the other areas, you know, where those schools are. So they have to go to different schools, and then we have to look at that and explore the need and try to get that going. But QPAST tries to get in there too as well. Yeah, so it's a demographic thing where the refugee kids and families live.
I was curious because there's, from all accounts, and this is going back probably 10 years ago at least, my ex-mother-in-law was a teacher at Zilmia at the Catholic school.
Oh, yeah, Zilmia had a lot of Sudanese in the early days.
Yeah.
That would be quite a while ago though now, Kath,
At least
wouldn't it?
10 years ago.
You haven't, but you know, I maintain that even if those little kids are Australian born, you know, trauma's intergenerational. We've learned that, I think, Nina, from the experience of the Jews and the post-Holocaust. It is intergenerational, and there's even something in people's makeup. If your parents or grandparents have experienced trauma, it can come down through the generations. That happens with our Indigenous people. You know, they might not be taken away now, but if they were taken away and deprived of good parenting or people who don't know, you know, it's not simple. That's why it's so good to have it available in a safe school setting. Yeah. And there are other programs. Nina, you probably know this one. It's called Courage to Care. It started in Victoria, and I know the Queensland coordinator of that. She's a friend of mine, and one year they had this local hero thing. So one year they awarded that to me because that message is a message for all of us. Don't be a bystander. So that's it was the story of a lot of Jewish people who'd escaped to freedom in Australia. Not very many alive now, maybe one or two left. And they all say, we're here because somebody helped us. And for every refugee girl who speaks on Women's Day, they all say, I could do this because somebody helped me. So whether it was a teacher at the school, whether it was a bursary, whether it was a guidance officer, whether it was a next door neighbour, somebody helped me. And I think those things are really important. They're so ordinary in a way, but they're so valuable.
Absolutely. All right. Can I get everybody to do the, sorry, Marnie, can you unmute?
What is it then? Like this, is it?
Beck has a question.
I just wanted to comment. When I lived in Sefton, I used to, when I was 17 and 18 and fresh out of school and uni, I used to go to the Villawood Detention Centre and volunteer my time. And it was absolutely life-changing for me. And it's taken me 20 years to start my social work degree after that experience. But yeah, it was absolutely, yeah, really life-changing all those years ago.
There were so many deaths at Villawood, Beck, so many people on the roof jumping and so many.
Yeah,
Villawood.
It really opened my eyes as a young 17, 18-year-old that's just come fresh out of school to fresh to uni. So
that's that would have been a very hard, probably stays with you.
Yeah, yeah.
Beck does a lot of work with youth at risk, Adele, so as well as people with disabilities, and sleep hygiene was one of the topics that she talked about during our mental health week interviews during October 2010. Yeah. And Sarah,
We'll have to chat.
2020.
yeah. So Sarah,
Mm.
sorry, not 2010. Thank you, Marnie. Sarah Cowley is one of our members as well, and she won a Rotary fellowship to go to the Peace Institute in Costa Rica, and very close
Yes,
to
I
where
think I remember that.
yeah, where that was a refugee camp, and that's where Sarah spent a lot of her time. So it's a shame she couldn't join the meeting tonight, but we might look at getting some of the younger members in another Zoom meeting and talk about that. So the symbol is holding your hands up like this, and what I'll try and do is, if everybody else wants to do that, and I'll take Adele, can you? I can't see you. You'll have to. Yeah. Okay. All right. So I'm going to do a.
Shirley, you
little-
just need to do it in front of you. Otherwise, you go into the, that's it. Beautiful. Lift up your hands a little bit more, Shirley. Yeah. No, put them down again. We can only see your head. That's good. Leave it like that.
All right. You ready? Paula, you ready? 1, 2, 3. Okay. Here we go. Well done. All right. So I did a print screen.
You do it again and I'll get you in it, Chris.
Oh, it doesn't matter. I've done a print screen.
Okay, we're ready.
Yeah.
Okie
Yes.
dokie. Done.
And Mandy,
ladies.
whereabouts are you from?
Tunbridge Wells
I-
and District.
Oh,
Yeah, I am from in the UK, and I was working. I suddenly saw your
Oh.
email. And I thought I'm going to click onto that.
well, give my love to Carolyn and to Anne Greenfield.
I
It was-
will.
I was in Tunbridge Wells
Ah,
2 years ago, almost like 2 weeks away. So
okay. There you go.
Fiona, Natasha and I were in New York this time in 2020, hot on the heels of that thing called Corona that was starting
Yeah,
to creep
exactly.
out there. And I did get to the UK and I spent a week with Anne, which was fabulous. So we did a bit
Lovely.
of suffragette walking around and
Oh,
talking
did
with
you?
Florida.
Very
And
interesting.
yeah, it was fabulous. And then I went up to stay with Hillary. So I'm pleased you were lurking. So how awesome
was.
is that for the UK to join us tonight too? Okay,
Unfortunately, I
everybody.
did miss a bit, so hopefully you'll send the recording and I can
She
actually.
will.
listen
Yeah, we'll
again.
certainly
Yeah,
do that.
thank
I
you.
won't be because I'm not technically competent in that space, but I have 2 wonderful members in my club that are. So it's a work in progress. Yeah. Thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
So
Thanks
it's
very
been
much,
a very
everyone.
beautiful way of celebrating International Women's Day. Adele, for every recognition that you have received, and I know you're very humble and never look for that particular thing, but you've always been my shiro, and that just continues to grow because, you know, you remind us of the things that are really important. And if Bettina was here tonight, she would have also made a comment about the storytelling, the lived experience, the listening to the experiences of people that have actually, you know, gone through there. And, you know, Nina's been working very closely with Maya Lee and her mum's story on The Nazis Knew My Name. And I've been on a Zoom meeting with them for that. But I grew up with migrants and refugees from the Second World War. So, you know, it's been just part of how I've worked, who I've lived with, you know, and it tears your heart out when you see what's happening. And in Bosnia, when the war broke out there, the clubs, the Sir Optimus clubs in Austria, they created rape kits and personal care items, and we could send money to them. And the other thing they asked us was to send a personal message, and then they would put those in the packs. And because ethnic cleansing was a strategic military strategy, particularly of the Serbs raping the Croatian women as a way of impregnating that generational lineage, those women that ended up being getting pregnant from those rapes suffered even more trauma, and a lot of them just could not care for their children, and those children were looked after by others. But the feedback was the one thing that meant more to the women in those camps was the fact that other women knew that they were there and were thinking of them. And we can't underestimate the value of just being able to send those positive messages and keep working home. If there was one action that you would challenge us to take on board tonight, Adele, what would it be?
I think writing to MPs, even to, well, I mean, I don't think we can talk about the, you mean in relation to the Ukraine war?
No,
I
just
think,
about this.
well, I just think to increase our special humanitarian refugee intake. And when there are crises like Afghanistan and Ukraine, to maintain the existing one and to make the other intake additional.
Yeah.
You know, don't make it sound like you're great, you're taking people when you're really not. You're just preventing other people from coming. So I think increase the special humanitarian intake.
Okay.
Would be just one thing. And we can do it. We've done it before. We know we used to take 20, 30,000 refugees from Indochina, mainly Vietnam. And now we take barely 13,000 and we haven't met our quota for the last 3 years.
Yeah. And there's a lot of people out there that, you know, open their homes and their hearts up. They will make all those things available.
We can do it. You know, we're basically kind and
yeah, we are.
We're good people and we can do it.
And we're best sisters. And it's just fabulous to be able to have the connections that we have here tonight. So I'm really grateful for everybody that did join in, and we'll get the recording out there and share it with others. But, you know, yeah, we are living in a very multicultural country, and young people growing up with young people from, you know, parents from all over the world, you know, they don't have this sense of, you know, us against them or what have you, and the greater integration that they have to feel a part of the community. And I know you have a lot of pride when you see how your students from Milpera have gone on, and many return to volunteer at Milpera, don't they?
They do.
Which makes your heart sing. Yeah. All right. Well, from Gubby Gubby Land, that's me saying good night. And thank you everyone for joining with us. I hope you gained something from Adele's conversation, and it's just a lovely way for Seroptimus members around the world to connect with each other. So good night, namaste, and
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Adele.
Good night. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Adele.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Adele, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you,
Thank
Adele.
you, Junko.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chris. Adele, wonderful
Thank you.
presentation. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Thank you. Good night. Good night,
Night.
everyone. Good night.
Paula's 4 hours ahead of us in New Zealand, so she's well and truly ready for bed. Yeah.
Adrian probably can't get off because she's not there.
Oh, well, never mind.